In 1858, a young girl named Bernadette was gathering firewood at her mother's request with her two sisters. On the way out to the woods, she had to stop and slow down because as a child, she had contracted at 2 years old cholera and was left with asthma for the rest of her life. When they were requested to go get the firewood, of course, the three children ran out into the woods, but because Bernadette was struck with asthma, she had to stop and slow down. And as she was taking off her shoes to go across the river that the two sisters had gone ahead of her, had crossed already, she suddenly described what she heard was a wind that was whispering through some bushes in a small grotto in a place called Massabielle. This all happened in France. And as she heard that breeze blowing through the bushes, she suddenly looked and realized that there was a lady standing in the bushes. It was a young lady, she described it. She wasn't sure what the figure was. She knew that she saw it. The lady said nothing to her, but eventually the young lady disappeared. Bernadette was rather excited having seen the sight because when she saw the vision, she knelt down and she began praying her rosary almost intuitively because she knew whoever it was that was standing in front of her was somehow somebody sent from heaven. When her sisters returned, they found her kneeling there still in front of the bush, and they decided that they should gather her, the sticks that they had gathered, and run back to the house to say that something had happened to Bernadette. And so they all ran back to the house, but this time, rather than falling behind, the young girl with asthma beat the other two sisters to her home. They began, as children do, to clamor in front of their parents, saying, "Bernadette saw something. Something happened." Her parents didn't believe her. Furthermore, she was asked to return to that place in that grotto at Massabielle, and she would again 20 more times, each time receiving a vision of what turned out to be a lady who described herself as the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception, of course, you may recognize, is the patroness of our parish. And that began the devotion to Our Lady of Lourdes. When now Saint Bernadette went to her family, when she went to her priest, when she went to the magistrate, who was more or less the governor of the town of Lourdes at the time, nobody believed her. Until finally there was a miracle. On one of the visitations, after kneeling for an hour, Bernadette was told by the lady that she ought to dig in the dirt near the grotto, away from the river, and put the dirt on her face and eat the plants that were growing there, the little plants. And she did as the lady had instructed. Would have been somewhat embarrassing, I suppose, to have done that in front of a now large crowd that had gathered because they heard of this young lady, this 14-year-old that was seeing this vision. As she was digging and putting this mud on her face and eating the plants, they began to laugh at her, to mock her. They thought it was a rather sad sight that this lady from heaven would ask her to do something that would put her out in front of people at such a young age. But as she began to dig, the group lost faith. They began to walk away because they didn't trust, first of all, what she was seeing, and they were sure that what she was doing was probably an indication that she was crazy. She was threatened by the magistrate that if she didn't deny what she was seeing, that he would boil her in oil. She would be taken away from her family. And all other sorts of harsh treatment were going to befall her if she didn't simply deny what she knew she saw. But eventually, as she began to dig for that source of water that the Lord Lady told her was there, something happened. What was mud where she started digging suddenly began to spring water. That water turned into a pool. And that pool still exists today in Lourdes, France, and Our Lady appeared under the title the Immaculate Conception, and whom we now know as Our Lady of Lourdes. I bring that up for two reasons. First of all, this month is February, and February 11th we're going to celebrate the Feast of Our Lady of Lourdes. Who has ever heard this story before? Could you raise your hand? Okay, many of you have. If you belong to this parish, and even if you don't, there was a movie made in 1943 about this entire thing that happened in 1858. It was 1943, and Jennifer Jones won the Academy Award for Best Actress. Today, if this movie would have come out, it would simply be shunned and put under the shelf, and nobody would ever even know it existed. I've ordered 10 copies of it for you to borrow. Unfortunately, I did not order within 2 hours and 43 minutes, as Amazon had indicated, and I did not get the 2-day shipping. And so they'll be arriving this week. But you yourself, it's a $7 movie. It's excellent. It's something you can watch with the family. It's funny, and there's no bad stuff, no violence, just the threats that they make against Bernadette. So I bring that story up for two reasons. First of all, you should know who the patroness of our parish is. And second of all, you should know the miraculous intercession that she can have with every one of our lives. Today in our gospel, we hear that Jesus comes into the synagogue, which was the place where Jews would be worshiping God. They would be hearing his word. And as Deacon preached last week, Jesus gets up and he reads this reading from Isaiah, and he tells them all, in your hearing this word, this scripture is fulfilled. They had heard about Jesus, as Deacon had said last week. They heard about Jesus and all the miracles that he was performing in Capernaum. What was Capernaum? Well, it was a pagan town. It wasn't known to be of Jewish origin, which means they weren't filled with people that were the chosen people as the Jews understood themselves to be. And so when Jesus comes to the synagogue, he comes to his own people. They see him, first of all, as a great miracle worker because they heard about what he was doing in Capernaum and in Sidon and all these other towns. And they figured, well, he's one of us. He should be able to do all kinds of things for us, miracles and wonders, etc., etc. And so when they got him in the synagogue, they were excited. But then he reads this passage, and it says, they were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. That word gracious is important. It's grace. To be gracious or to speak graciously is all in the order of grace. When the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary, she said, "Hail, full of grace." What is grace? And every one of us, we need to know what this is. Grace is not a thing. It's our relationship with God. We can be full of grace and have a strong relationship with God, and we can have no grace. Well, we can't really have no grace, but we can have a very low amount of grace in accordance with our relationship with God. Our Lady, full of grace. All of us, somewhere along the line. The trick is that we're all meant to be full of grace, and so when Jesus speaks, his words are gracious. What does that mean? That Jesus has the fullness of the relationship with God. But there's another order that comes into play in our gospel today, and that is the order of nature. Jesus' biological origins. Jesus' heavenly origins, his gracious origins, his spiritual origins come from God the Father. But he also has biological origins that come from Mary and Joseph. Well, really just Mary. But they recognize his biological origins and they mistrust his spiritual ones. The reason I bring this up, friends, is because our secular society, and secular just means of the age, our society has convinced us that there really is no spiritual order. Like the people in the synagogue in Jesus' day that can see nothing but the biological order, the reality is that their vision of the world is a world without hope. Because if Jesus is nothing and has no origins other than his biological origins, they had a beginning with his parents, and they will have an ending with his death. But his gracious words mean something else. This is the point. We have two origins. Every human being. We have an origin in God, the soul, and we have an origin in our biological makeup, who we are as bodies. And very oftentimes, friends, because of our secular society, we're blinded from our spiritual origins. And time and again throughout history, our Lord and Our Lady intercede to remind us of the spiritual order, just as she did for Saint Bernadette 150 years ago, just as she did at Fatima in 1917, just as she did in almost the same year in 1858 in Champion, Wisconsin. That's another devotion that you should probably be familiar with because it's in our diocese, when Our Lady saved an entire area from the Peshtigo fire. An unexplainable miracle. Our society, our culture, very oftentimes detests the order of grace. They challenge the order of grace. Try this next time you're at work this week. I want you to just say Jesus in a conversation. You sit down at lunch, you're having your sandwich. Hey, what do you guys think about Jesus? What do you guys think about God? Did you hear about this guy that rose from the dead? Did you know about this lady that appeared 80 years ago at Fatima? And 70,000 people witnessed the dancing of the sun. An entire drenched landscape became dry in a matter of minutes. What do you think about that? Friends, like Jeremiah and like Jesus in our gospel, very oftentimes to point out the spiritual order of things draws a certain ire from those who hear it, because they're so conditioned by the order of nature that they have no hope in the order of grace. But we do. A deacon last week talked about the importance of grace operating in people's lives, and it operates in everyone's life. And I just want to help you see two things today. The first thing is that every one of us here has a vision of our life. Friends, every one of you know that the Lord speaks to your heart and asks you to do and to say certain things. Things that very oftentimes we deny. Why? Because we're embarrassed. Because in some sense, the reality is we can be ashamed of the spiritual order. But in that, friends, is our salvation. Jesus, when he comes to his own town, they can only see his biological origins, but he's so much more. If you only live as a secular culture and somehow insist that you live, you're denying your spiritual origins in God. The story of Our Lady of Lourdes, if you watch the movie with your family, you can get popcorn and sit down and watch the movie, helps remind you that there is an order of grace to which your hearts are constantly being called. Never deny the order of grace in your own life, because you are much more, and you know you want to be much more than you are today and now. The other side of the coins, friends, is the reality is that very oftentimes, like the people in the synagogue today, we like to keep people in their place. I recognize this as a priest because after 8 years of seminary, for the first time, my sister and my brother-in-law and their family came down to listen to me preach at St. Raphael of the Archangel. And after Mass, she came to shake my hand and she said, "You know, it actually sounded like you knew what you were talking about." But she will always know me as her brother. But my sister and I have had spiritual conversations. We've wondered why other of our family members don't talk about their relationship with the Lord too. But that's the reality, friends, is if we don't talk about it, it remains hidden. If Jesus didn't talk about it in the synagogue today, he could have been very easily just get along and live according to the order of nature, but eventually living according to the order of grace would eventually lead him to the cross. Friends, there is a demonic attack on the spiritual order. The world, the flesh, and the devil. And I say the devil hardly even needs to enter into the picture because most of us follow the order of the world and the order of the flesh. And the devil's work is very easy. So what do? You have to trust in the order of grace. You have to trust in God's vision for yourself. And as St. Therese reminded us so many years ago, a saint is simply a sinner that never gives up. And you are a person who is called to be a saint. It's simple logic. You're all called to go to heaven. There is no one in heaven who is not a saint. Therefore, you are called to be a saint, unless you don't want to go to heaven. Who wants to go to heaven here? Good. Everyone's raising their hand. Some a little reluctantly, not really sure. That's okay. It does mean, friends, that we have to stand up for our faith in our families and even with our friends sometimes. But at the same time, we also have to trust that the order of grace is working in every person's life. And like St. Bernadette, if we can begin digging into that, slowly at first, being willing to undergo maybe some of the embarrassment or ridicule that we might undergo for doing it, we will find a fountain. We will find a fountain. There were 69 miracles attributed to that water in Lourdes that were actually confirmed, but there are more untold ones that we don't even know about, that people maybe have never said or we never investigated scientifically, but they number in the thousands. Don't restrict yourself to the order of nature, because that is not your ultimate calling. Let's ask the Lord today, especially as Catholics, friends, in this sacrament of faith that we have before us, that just as Jesus appeared in the synagogue as something familiar before them, so once again the Eucharist is going to appear before us at this Mass that unfortunately so oftentimes we treat as something just as a regular part of our week, because we don't always ask the Lord to help us see deeper into the reality of what we see as bread and wine in the order of nature, to follow more deeply in love with the Lord in the order of grace. And let's ask the Lord for that help to be brave soldiers in his order of grace in our families, in our workplaces. And friends, when we ask for that strength, we'll get it. And so let's ask the Lord for that help today as we continue our journey as Christians today. And may we continue to give our hearts to the Lord today, little by little.